I'd now like to call the next speaker. The topic is cotton and synthetic fibers. Mr. Eric Trachtenberg is the Executive Director of the International Cotton Advisory Committee, ICAC, directing strategies in textile and cotton initiatives. Mr. Trachtenberg has 2 master's degrees and is the co-founder of agriculture training in McClarty Associates.
I apologize that I don't speak Portuguese, but maybe next time I'll try to get a little bit better. First of all, I wanted to thank ANEA for an invitation to engage with the Brazilian industry. I also wanted to thank Abrapa for being such wonderful hosts during the early parts of this trip, where I was actually able to go visit some production in Mato Grosso, visited a port in Santos, and had some really good engagement with Abrapa and the Brazilian government in Brasilia. This is actually my first trip to Brazil, and after having been here a little more than a week, I'm thinking, God, I wish I'd gotten here sooner. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about cotton futures and the opportunities. And I'm going to be going pretty fast, but we will make the slides available. So for those of you who don't know what ICAC is, the way I like to think of it for people who are new to us is it's like the United Nations of cotton and related products. We are actually 6 years older than the United Nations, and we're an intergovernmental commodity body, and we report to 27 member countries, of which Brazil is one. So our purpose is to help cotton succeed around the world, regardless of origin. What do we do? This is just a bulleted list of some of our activities. We provide a lot of data, publications, and the instrument testing that I think was alluded to in one of the videos. Our data, I see a lot of reference ICAC, and I think that's a really important aspect of what we do, is data is the basis of all of our activities, because if we don't have good data, everything else becomes difficult. And if we have good data, a lot of other intriguing things become possible. We're doing more work in agriculture development, sustainability and traceability, textiles, private sector, brands and retail, promotion, and a lot more policy engagement and support. So I think most of you are familiar with these numbers. I think what's interesting is that even though area has been stagnant for almost 6-7 decades, is that production has continued to go up because of improved technology, improved use of resources, and better quality inputs. At the same time, we see that production and mill use, they sort of have been going in tandem. And I think one of the things that really drives prices is when production goes a little bit higher than mill use, then it pushes prices down. But you can see that there have been years where production was higher, and if you were to look at prices, that would probably drive them down. One thing that also is quite an interesting note is that textile demand is very deeply correlated with economic activity. And so if you're looking at, and if you go, and you even look at it globally, but you also look at nationally. So if you have a pretty solid prediction of where you think economics are going, then you must be very rich. But anyway, if you have a very solid prediction of where economics are going, you can really see the correlation. I think the regression is like 0.7 or 0.8 for the math people in the audience. But this is a chart that you've seen probably in a lot of different forms. Even though consumption's gone up, it's been heavily dominated by synthetics. And cotton's market share, unfortunately, is probably likely to fall to 21% this year. So our market share continues to decline. So what is the primary driver of it? And it's really mostly been losses in market share to polyester. The nylon and some of the others, they're growing, but really polyester is the big driver. And you can see that when you look at oil, there is an increasing interest in having that process into plastic, because as the green transition continues, there will be more and more pressure downward on oil prices, so there'll be more interest in pushing those out into synthetic fibers. So our competitors are cheaper, and they're quite aggressive about expanding their market. So you can see that most of the growth has come from China in terms of synthetics. There's been some in India, a little bit in Europe, but really primarily it comes from China. And China is really the key driver. I mean, I know Brazil is really focused on exports. I know the competitors in both Australia and the United States are also focused on the Chinese market. Number one in production, number one in mill use, number one in imports, number one in yarn imports. I mean, right down the line, what happens in China really affects the global cotton economy in a very profound way. And as we can see, this is sort of the bad news part. Why isn't this transition completed? But you can see that cotton has been slowly losing market share. One thing that we've noted over at ICAC, and I wanted to thank Lorena Rios, who's somewhere in the audience, who prepared a lot of these slides, that there also volatility itself is a problem. So if prices were steady, then it would actually be better. We've noticed that ever since, whenever there's a price spike in cotton, the market share falls quite significantly after that. And when we've talked to people in the textile sector, they say, if the prices were high and they just stayed high, we could somehow live with it. But what we can't live with is the uncertainty. Their margins are tight, and if their product line specifies cotton and the prices spike and they're still locked into these contracts, then their margins go negative. So we do lose market share. So this is a list of some of the challenges we face. One, it's a natural fiber. It's variable. On the other hand, this is an advantage because it's biodegradable. It has the potential to reduce poverty. It drives women's empowerment. I know there's a Women in Cotton session later today. And actually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, cotton can play a very positive role in fighting climate change by sequestering carbon. Our chief scientist, Dr. Keshav Kranthi, has actually done a lot of work that shows properly cultivated, cotton can actually be part of the solution. So one of the things we're actually trying to think of is there a possibility to get payment for ecosystem services for carbon sequestration? Very speculative, but we can see how powerful cotton can be as part of the solution to the climate crisis. Cotton is also xerophyte, which means it does very well in arid conditions. There are certain parts of the world that cotton is really the best cash crop. That's not true so much in Brazil because of Mato Grosso, you can grow other things. But for instance, in Texas, in the United States, or certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, cotton is really the best crop they've got by a lot. And then, of course, we all like the feeling of cotton. But we do face a number of challenges. It's more expensive. Fast fashion is also a disadvantage for cotton. It's a natural product, so it varies. It has the characteristics. It's a complicated product. I mean, fortunately, we do have these HVI labs where they can measure, but it's not as easy to control quality as you just run a polyester plant and fiber comes out. There's also a lot of incorrect information about cotton. I know, we've all faced these things where they say cotton's really bad, and whatever the story is. It uses lots of water and pesticides, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later too. And ICAC, we try to tell the truth about cotton because guess what? We're better, and we just need to make our case more powerfully. We compete with other crops, and then there's a lack of competitiveness in engineered and functional uses. And actually, ICAC is looking at that issue, creating a cotton innovation platform. And then there's always competition for consumer spending. Speaking of consumer spending, this is a US market, but we can see that apparel and services are a small and diminishing share of consumer spending. In the United States, we've seen a huge increase in housing costs, and it's actually becoming even a political issue in the US. And so these other kinds of expenses go out, it squeezes the market, and when you squeeze the market, they say, oh, I want to get cheaper inputs. And that can drive the fiber market to polyester and away from cotton. Again, there's also an opportunity. I know Brazil is one of the world's top producers, both in quantity, quality, and in productivity. But if we're thinking about how to expand cotton's productivity elsewhere, there are opportunities. Yields are very low in India. They're very low in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is considerable potential to increase cotton productivity, especially outside Brazil, which is already very high. So, jumping to another issue, I wanted to talk a little about these attacks on cotton and why they're mostly not true. People often say, oh, cotton is just using all this land. It's using 2.5% of global arable land. Using lots of water. No, it's using less than 2% of irrigated water. Pesticide, by volume or by value, less than 5%. Only uses less than 3% of fertilizer. So when you look at pesticide use, it's 4.8%. But you read a lot in the press about how terrible cotton is. It's just not true. On the other hand, what is true is the ability of cotton to help be climate positive. Cotton fabrics sequester carbon. Biochar sequesters carbon. Cover crops sequester carbon. No-till can help sequester carbon. So when you look at cotton versus the other fibers, it has one of the lowest greenhouse gas impacts out there. Again, we're just better. Then going even more deeply into this. Cotton in the environment. Cotton is largely cellulose, which is carbon. Cotton fabrics and furniture make cotton stalk particle boards. Again, locks in carbon. And biochar that can be produced from cotton stalks can lock carbon in for 100 years. This is one of the reasons why that there is great potential for cotton to play a positive role in the environmental debate. So going to the next issue is, what does the road for us at ICAC look at? Since we're a global organization, we have some priorities that are really driven by our African members, many priorities which are driven by Brazil, and some that are driven by, for instance, we do report to the EU. So we're looking at doing a lot more in agriculture development, which clearly the Brazil cotton sector does not need much of. But also making this really strong support for traceability and sustainability. We need to make that case. And also we need to prepare for regulatory changes. One thing that we've gotten very deeply involved in is the EU Green Deal and all the regulations that are coming. The EU regulations are a terrible threat or a great opportunity. It depends on what we can make of it. On one hand, the regulations seem to be moving against natural fibers, but I don't think that's locked in. I think it's something we may be able to change. Because if you look at the goals of these EU regulations, it's to increase circularity, it's to decrease greenhouse gases, it's to help improve the environment. If they follow that through consistently, it could actually help natural fibers. But this is very much a hot issue, and we've been working with the Brazilians and with others to try to really engage Europe. Also, we're doing much more in the textile sector, which is a bit of a new thing for us, that We're going to have a textile portal. We're looking at also working within Africa to help improve their textile sector. One thing that's interesting about that project is actually next week, I'm going to start 5 weeks of travel through Africa. The reason why I'm talking about it is if the textile sector in Africa progresses, they will not have crop available all the time. There will be times where they will need to import because capital intensivity is very, very high. So if the textile sector in Africa grows very quickly, it could actually be an opportunity for Brazil cotton. So sometimes these linkages are a little unexpected. So again, this is our focus. More things we're doing is we're going to be working on country collaboration. The big issue we always face is who pays for sustainability and traceability. One thing that kind of is a little frustrating is when you're working with poor farmers, smallholder farmers, and they're selling their product, and all of a sudden there's a new standard. And these small farmers who are very poor lose their market. And I think in some ways, I think it's the people who impose the standards that have a responsibility to help smallholder farmers comply. Again, this isn't a problem so much faced in Brazil, but this whole idea of who pays for sustainability is really important because nobody seems to want to pay for it, so it always ends up landing on the people who can least afford it. And so I want also, speaking of sustainability, I wanted to just highlight a report that recently our panel on the social, environmental, economic panel just finished a few months ago. And it's a very busy slide, but it really is an important issue about what is regenerative agriculture. Everybody talks about regenerative. Oh, it's a good thing. Well, what does it really mean? Well, this report actually goes into detail. It takes a number of standards and says, what does that standard mean? Does it require cover crops? Does it require livestock? Does it require human rights? So we actually mapped out all these standards and say how many regenerative standards include these different practices. And we also did a chart and we said, how hard will it be for certain kinds of farmers to use those practices? For instance, if you say cover crops, it could be hard for one kind of farmer, but not hard for another. So from a Brazilian point of view, this is quite significant because some of these regenerative standards, may be difficult for Brazil to comply with because it doesn't fit into your ag system. Now, fortunately, you have a lot of coverage under BCI. But one of the things that we notice is that sometimes a new standard will say, we're the better standard. We're the super better standard. And it's like an arms race. Who can have the more incredible standard? So it's one thing just to keep an eye on about the proliferation of standards. And some of those standards could include practices that may be difficult for farmers here to comply with. So it's just, I would definitely recommend this report. And it's easy to read, I promise. It's not like lots of formulas and charts. It's a very quick read. So we have a number of meetings coming up. We have our 82nd plenary meeting in Uzbekistan from September 29th to October 3rd. Not only is Uzbekistan actually a really nice country to visit, but it's also a chance to engage with the other countries that are really active, especially on the policy level with cotton. Also, it's an interesting chance to look at Uzbekistan's experience because Uzbekistan 10 years ago used to export $1 billion of cotton. And thanks to some very forward-leaning policies of the government and collaboration with the private sector, they now export $4.5 billion of textiles. So they're a really big success story. The next event is right after our plenary is the World Cotton Research Conference. For those who have a strong interest in the science of cotton production, this is probably the world's preeminent event to go and see what others around the world are doing. Of course, an event that we're all focused on is World Cotton Day, and it is actually an official event on the UN calendar. It's celebrated every October 7th. This year, ICAC is the host organization, and we decided to bring it to Africa for the first time. And it'll actually be a 3-day event held in Cotonou in Benin. And again, here is us exploring the cotton fields of Mato Grosso last week. I want to thank Alexander, wherever he is, for his great hospitality, and Abrapa. It was a great trip, and I learned a lot. And here are contacts. And I look forward to working with all of you and making a stronger, better global cotton economy. Thank you.
Obrigado, Eric, pela apresentação. Eu, conhecendo meus conterrâneos, eu diria que o que você apresentou para nós é uma grande oportunidade para o nosso crescimento, a questão do carbono, para o algodão, uma fibra natural. Eu tenho certeza que esse trabalho conjunto que nós vamos fazer com os demais países produtores de algodão vai ser uma grande oportunidade para a gente poder produzir mais, vender mais e crescer o nosso negócio.